All right. Let's see. How do you get this to go backwards? All right. Well, welcome to today's workshop, and I am going to be finishing up the last three battle strategies that we were beginning to introduce last time. By way of introduction, just in case a few more people show up too, one of the things I'm supposed to do when I go speak places is give people the opportunity to sign up for our Deeper Walk newsletter, because none of you get enough emails. So I'm going to, but I will say the advantage to these is that we do a lot of free training. We offer once to twice a month, we have free webinars that cover everything from parenting to leadership to addiction recovery topics. And in fact, next Friday, I'm going to be doing a webinar with the author of Respect Dare, which is a book that came out following the Love Dare books, and she and I are going to be talking about marriage and parenting. So there will be a lot of those, and so when you sign up for the email list, you automatically find out and get links to all of the things that come up, and find out when the special deals are on books and things like that come along. So I'm just going to put name and email on here, and if you are interested, I'm also, since I don't have a clipboard, using the book we're talking about, Slaying the Monster, as the kind of the book underneath there. Some of you are already part of our list, but give you the opportunity to do that. Let's go ahead and open in prayer, and then we'll dive into today's topic. Father God, I'm grateful that even though we live in a world at war, and we're born into a world that is really messed up, and there's a lot of heavy issues that we have to process through in life, that through it all, you are more than enough. You've got enough joy, you've got enough wisdom, you've got enough power. You're happy to walk with us through whatever dark valleys we need to walk through to get where you want us to be, and where we can share your love. And I just pray that what we teach in here, what we discuss, will be helpful for many, many people as they go through their own journeys in this regard. So we just invite you now to be present with us, to speak to our hearts, and to guide us where we need to go and to what we need to accomplish in the time we have. In Christ's name, amen. All right, well, the last time we introduced 6 battle strategies for overcoming pornography, and just to be honest, I mean, these battle strategies could be applied to almost any habitual problem that a person has. It's just that we've taken these 6 and applied them to the issue of pornography specifically. And one of the reasons we do this is that we all struggle, right? All of us have issues. And if you go to the number 6 here, the growing maturity, one of the things that we talked about last time is that we all have just a certain amount of emotional capacity. And I look at our emotional capacity a little bit like, a little bit like cups. Like this is an 8-ounce cup, and this is a 16-ounce cup, and this is a 32-ounce really big cup. And so what happens is stop and think about it, is that this cup represents my capacity to act like myself and to stay who I am and not turn into a different person. And so what I find is that, if I have 8 ounces of emotional capacity, which means I can handle 8 ounces of stress in my life before the cup overflows, as long as the stress in my life stays below 8 ounces, I'm good. I act like myself. I can be relational with people. I stay engaged with people. Things are good. But the problem comes if I only got 8 ounces of capacity and I have to deal with 12 ounces of stress. And now the cup overflows and I can't handle it. And because I can't handle it, I start to feel a little crazy inside, and I start feeling a little off, like I'm not me. This is not, and I just wanted to stop, and I begin developing a lot of bad habits in my life around those times when I get overwhelmed and just stop feeling like myself. Does that make sense? So when we get to number 6, one of the things that we're going to be talking about here is it's not enough just to beat a bad habit and get it to stop. I've actually got to have a plan for how am I going to grow from 8 ounces of capacity to 16 ounces. How am I going to grow from 16 ounces to 32? Because the goal is to get to a point where, the same amount of stress doesn't overwhelm me like I used to. And this is why you find a lot of people who, what they do is they try their best to control their world and keep it as stress-free as possible. And so one of the ways that we keep our world stress-free is by, we watch a lot of TV, because there's not asking for a whole lot from us relationally. I don't have to be all that relationally engaged to watch a lot of TV. I'll surf the internet a lot because, again, it's not that relationally demanding on me. A great day is where I've got my drink and I've got something to munch on, and I get to watch TV and I don't have to interact with anybody, and I feel perfectly happy. I feel like everything's good. And so into this situation, somebody walks into the room and brings a problem, okay? And so whether it's my kid or whether it's, my wife or whether it's a boss, calling up and saying, hey, what about this, what about this? It's enough that it raises the stress level to a point where I just don't have the capacity to deal with that right now. And so when my stress level goes up like that and I just don't feel like I've got the capacity to deal with this, I tend to handle those problems in very non-relational ways. And that is, I don't stay relationally engaged with the people around me. I switch flips. I turn into a different person. I just don't act like myself. And then afterwards, I'm like, man, I still don't feel like myself. I still haven't really returned to joy. I haven't gotten, there's now a mess around here. And so I want to feel better. And it's usually in those moments where I'm feeling down, I'm feeling disconnected from people anyway. I'm feeling overwhelmed anyway. And I just want to disconnect and do something else, where I am most susceptible to any addiction that I have. Okay, so it can be a more socially acceptable one, like Angry Birds, where, I'll just play 100 games of Angry Birds, and just blow an hour, because what I'm doing is basically my way of saying I'm beyond my capacity, I'm overwhelmed, I don't want any people around, I just got to recover. But some of us, when we get to those places, we end up doing things that are more self-destructive. And that's when we binge on alcohol, that's when we binge on food that we shouldn't be eating, it's when we binge on pornography. And it's because I'm beyond my capacity. So when we get here, one of the things we're going to talk about is how do we begin to grow my capacity? Because even if I beat the behavior specifically, I'm not going to stay free, and I'm not going to stay beyond that if I'm not growing my capacity. So we'll discuss that as well, and if you got questions along the way, by all means, feel free to ask. So let's start with, I guess I've got control of this, don't I? Let's start with getting at the roots. If you're familiar with the book I wrote called Understanding the Wounded Heart, there's a model in there that basically says that when my heart gets wounded, it's like a plow going through soil and turning over the soil, and that soil's now ready to receive seeds. And so we've got two farmers, both with a bag of seeds. We've got the Holy Spirit, who is the Spirit of truth, so we've got a bag of true seeds. We got the Father of lies. He's got a bag of lie seeds. They both want to get those seeds into that wounded place in my heart. If the devil is the one who is successful, and into that wounded place in my heart, I get lies like, I'm worthless, or a lot of women I talk to, I'm a slut, what's wrong with me? Or guys, I'm just weak, that's just who I am, I'm inadequate, whatever. But these lies get placed in here, and the problem here is I have evidence that they're true. It's like, I did sleep with this person, I did go to that website, I did do this sexually inappropriate thing. I've got evidence that would suggest that, well, this is who I am, this is my identity. But the problem is, if those lies get rooted in here, with them begin another surrounding set of lies, such as, well, God must not be happy to see me, God must be disgusted with me, God can't be very, thrilled. And so now I'm feeling shame about my very core identity, because what has happened here has allowed these lies to get planted inside. So what I find is that there are often multiple root issues underneath something like a battle with pornography. And those multiple root issues, to a large extent, are these lies playing themselves out in my behavior. So I find for some people, for example, there is not just wounds underneath the planted lies, but there are actually what I call sexualized trauma. And that is that the trauma that happened to you had a sexual component to it. Perhaps somebody propositioned you, or maybe somebody took advantage of you, or maybe somebody did something they shouldn't have been doing, or maybe a trusted older person introduced you to pornography and you weren't really asking for it or looking for it. Now here it is. But there could be any number of these. But when I'm looking at roots, I'm looking for a couple of things. Number one, we're always looking for the first exposure to pornography that somebody ran into. And we want to ask God, would you bring to the surface right now, what was my first introductory exposure to pornography? That's one of the roots we're going after. But other roots could be there as well, and that is to ask God, Lord, are there wounds in my past where the devil has succeeded in planting lies that are contributing to my problem with pornography? And what I want to do is I want to identify, these are the wounds that come to mind when I pray about this, and you begin working with God and with other people to try to put together, okay, here are the core wounds, and here are the core things that they have taught me. And then this is how my flesh has responded to this belief. My flesh has responded by taking control of my life. And one of the ways I take control of my life is I try to keep it manageable so that I don't get overwhelmed. Now, we call those vows. Vows are I will statements. So say, I will never let myself get overwhelmed. I'll never let myself go through this again. I'm going to take control. And so what happens is instead of trusting God, I begin to take control. By the way, it does sound like there's going to be a thunderstorm while we're in here, so we'll see how that how that goes. I'm the one with the electrical headset on, so we should be all right. Yeah. If I light up, you guys will don't touch me while I'm glowing. Okay. One of the reasons we get to this is that a lot of times when people say, well, I have a stronghold in the area of pornography, I can't seem to break this stronghold. But they don't know what to do to break it. And so what we're talking about is, the stronghold is like the fruit then that has grown off of the vine of these vows that I've made. And the vines have grown up from the seeds that have been planted, and the seeds got, open doors through the wounded things that have happened to me. So, for example, I got a friend who was following this pattern and praying with a man who came to see him for his pornography addiction. And so, again, based on what we've been teaching, if somebody came to you and said, I've been really struggling with porn, I can't seem to get on the other end of it, a good starting place would be, well, let's take some time to pray and ask God to help you remember the very first time that ever happened, that you were introduced to this, and let's start there. And so they went back, and as he prayed that, he said, I see myself as a 9-10-year-old boy. I'm standing next to the mailbox. And he said, okay, what happens next? He says, well, I open the mailbox, and there is my dad's subscription to Playboy. And I pick it up, and I go disappear for an hour. And that's the day I was introduced to all of this. And he said, all right, well, let's do this then. We need to treat that as trauma, not as congratulations. Yay, aren't you the lucky guy? That is, we got to look at that as a traumatic thing that a 9-year-old shouldn't have to deal with, or a 10-year-old shouldn't have to deal with. And so what we do is say, so your heart was wounded by being introduced to this when you were way too young. So now the next question is, so what lies did the devil plant in your heart that day? And one of the lies, is this is good, right? That what I've been introduced to is good. And that I'm supposed to do this. I'm supposed to want this and to engage in this. And then the next thing he did is he said, well, let's ask Jesus where he was when that happened and see if he'd be willing to just kind of part the veil a little bit and show you where he was. Now, an interesting thing happened. So the guy said, all right, Jesus, would you be willing to show me where you were that day when I was introduced to pornography? And he said, okay, I see Jesus. He's standing next to me. He's got his arms folded like this, and he's just shaking his head like, man, I am so disappointed in you. Now, do any of you have any cautions, like yellow flags, red flags about that? Does that sound like Jesus to you? Yeah, it doesn't sound like Jesus to me either. I mean, this guy needs emotional healing. He doesn't need a Jesus who's like, I'm so disappointed and ashamed in you, right? You know who that sounded like, though? The Jesus he grew up with. When he was 9 years old, that was the Jesus he knew. He knew the Jesus of legalism, right? So guess who the Jesus was who showed up the first time he prayed about it was the Jesus of this legalistic experience. And so my friend told him, he said, well, that doesn't really sound right. Why don't we just test that? And he had him pray a prayer like this: in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, if that is a counterfeit, not the true Jesus, I command him to leave. And the thing disappeared like that. Gone. And he prayed again. He said, now I invite the true Lord Jesus to come and show me what he wants to show me. And Jesus showed up and was, more the arm around the shoulder. Hey, man, this never should have happened to you. I'm so sorry. I'm here for you. I love you. This isn't who you are, right? So whereas the devil had been planning a lie, this is who you are, right? You are just a twisted, perverted person. This is, Jesus showed up in that root memory now saying, no, this is not who you are. This was never supposed to happen. This was traumatizing. And so by going back to this root memory and treating the very first exposure to this as something traumatizing, using kind of the wound, lie, vow, stronghold approach to it, this guy was able to experience a whole new level of freedom in his journey. Now, does that mean he's never going to be tempted? No, I mean, it's not that you're never going to be tempted, but something broke, right? One of these chains there broke that day because the vine kind of got uprooted, the seeds got taken out, and truth seeds finally managed to get their way into this wounded place in his life. Now, I found it much more effective to walk people through praying to Jesus and hearing for themselves and having Jesus tell me what they're hearing than for me to simply tell them, right? Because this guy had probably been told 100 times, oh, you're not a pervert, you're not this way, you're a saint and God loves you, but it's all up here kind of in the brain and not in the heart. And so one of the ways that we get information from our heads down into our heart is by connecting with God at the point of that interference of what it is that is blocking the connection from here down to here. And so that's what happened. I can repeat this story, dozens of times of people who treated the first introduction to pornography as trauma, asked God to show them what the lies were that the devil succeeded in planting in here, identifying these are the lies, beginning to ask God, what's the truth you want me to know, and then asking Jesus personally to meet them in that trauma. Now, when Jesus meets you in the trauma, he doesn't always show up in a way that you can visually see him, but what will happen is you'll have a new perspective on the trauma. All right, it'll mean something different to you than it did before. And so it all comes across in different ways. So when we're talking about getting at the roots, this is what we're talking about. It's an effective battle strategy. Now, the reason we have 6 of them is that we're trying not to make it sound like if you just do this one thing, everything will get fixed. But this is a very important one, and for a lot of people, they aren't going to get through to the breakthrough they're looking for until they do this. And so that's what we're after here is that, God, show me what the trauma is, show me what the wound is, show me what the lies are that I have been believing. Because even though the trauma is in the past, where are the lies? Are the lies in the past? No, even though the trauma is in the past, the lies are in the present. And so are the vows, and so are the strongholds, are all in the present. So we go into the past long enough to figure out what the roots are and the origins are in order to deal with those things. All right, any questions on this part before we move to the next strategy? I teach on this all the time, so sometimes I forget what.
Is all this in a book?
All of this is in the book, Understanding the Wounded Heart, but all of this is in the book, Slaying the Monster. But if you want more just on this point, the book, Understanding the Wounded Heart. Yep. There's also, we have an institute course, and course 1 is free online. So if you go to our website, deeperwalkinternational.com or .org, they both get you there. and you go to course 1, you can click on the tabs and you can watch this free streaming video of all of these. And there is one session just on this topic there. And then if you want more, we've got a whole course on emotional healing that can be purchased and watched. So we have 4 courses that are all available. The first one's free. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yes. So you're saying, well, this is back to the stress level. All right. And isn't it a good idea to try to keep the stress level low? Yeah. So what happens is well, on that point, so if I've got 8 ounces of capacity, the problem is that if my only strategy is to try to live at 7 ounces of stress, what it means is I live my life avoiding an awful lot of adult responsibilities. So I don't deal with my kids like an adult like I should. I don't deal with my workplace like an adult like I should. So while there are times when absolutely the right thing to do is you got to unload some things and get them off and de-stress, it's not a long-term strategy for success. We've got to build the capacity long-term. All right. I guess I have the flipper. Any other questions before we move forward? All right. So we come then to the spiritual warfare part of this. And I was talking to a pastor a few years ago, and he said that his porn addiction just, basically cost him his ministry at one point. And he had to go for help. And so they sent him to the traditional, SA groups and NA groups. And he went through the traditional things that people do for help. And he said it worked. He put a blocker on his computer to keep certain websites from being harder to access. There's almost always a way around it if you really want to, but it makes it harder to access. And he said he had been a couple of months where he was clean in the sense that he had not gone to an actual porn website. He said, but I got to be honest. He said it was in my head all of the time. He said, I may not have been going to the sites, but I was like, man, a pretty girl walked by and bam, my mind just went there and I played out a whole porn video in my head almost instantly. And this is what is so discouraging for a lot of guys. They're like, I'm seeing some steps and some victories here, but man, how do I get it out of my head? I've seen so many thousands of pictures and so many hundreds of videos and so much stuff. It's like it plays in my head constantly. It's always in the background. It takes almost nothing to trigger it, and it's poof, there it goes. And you're like, why am I bothering? There's a sense of hopeless despair kind of settles in. So you got shame driving it. You got hopeless despair driving it, and it's like, what do I do? So, again, if a pastor comes and he's telling me I can't beat this just with the usual tools that are out there, and he said, but I'll tell you what gave me the breakthrough, because he was sharing his testimony with me. He said, I went through Neil Anderson's Steps to Freedom in Christ. He said, and for me, that was the breakthrough thing. My mind began to clear up a lot more. It's not that I never struggle with it. He said, but it is nothing like it used to be. And so let me explain, we got a black bird up here. I'll kind of explain the way I understand the warfare into this. And that is that spiritual warfare has a legal foundation to it, which means that in order that demons need permission to do whatever it is that they do. So the question is, what has given demons permission to do this? So, for example, in my life, when I found a stack of Playboy magazines when I was 7 years old, so the question is, what gives the demons permission to do something like that to a 7-year-old? Well, in this case, it's because another family member of mine had already opened that door. And so there was they had permission to do this, and already there was like a spirit of lust that took advantage of what happened at age 7. So now that's a childhood trauma, but it's also a spiritual warfare event. And what often happens is that somebody has entered into an agreement with the devil, and that agreement with the devil has given permission to demons to be present. And one way of illustrating it is if you think of a demon like a talking blackbird, I look at it this way. So let's say there's a big tree here full of these blackbirds, and these blackbirds report to some nastier things up above them, but they're the, on the ground feet. And I'm walking down the campground here, and all of a sudden I see one of these girls go by wearing, showing a little more skin than, just enough that it gets my imagination going, and all of a sudden a bird comes and lands on my shoulder and makes sure that I see it, right? That's the first job, make sure that I see it. And then it's going to start making suggestions, and until I say stop, they're just going to keep on making suggestions. Right? It's like, well, hey, think about this, think about this, think about this, right? And they're just, and it's like a train going by, and as that train goes by, more and more cars go down. That train is harder to stop, the more cars that you let go by. And so what happens for a lot of us, we don't even think of this as a spiritual warfare event. We just think of it as a flesh event. And so instead of turning against the enemy and saying, you get out of here and you take those thoughts with you, I am going to be a protector in this situation, not a predator. So in order to be a protector in this situation, I cannot be entertaining predatory thoughts. So these thoughts aren't coming from me. My heart's good. My heart's redeemed. My heart wants to be good and do the right thing. So this has to be coming from the enemy. So in the name of Jesus, you get out of here and take this with you. The sooner you do that, the sooner that this stops. But the longer you let it go, the harder it is to do that. Now, let's suppose that the other thing that happens is, so let's suppose this bird is successful and gets you going a certain ways with your fantasy life. And just as you get to a certain point, another bird lands on the other shoulder and says, I thought you were a Christian. What is wrong with you? You may just be the worst Christian who ever lived. Here you are at Brown City Camp. Weren't you at the altar last night? You are such a hypocrite. Said, this Christianity stuff doesn't work. Right? And it just comes in. There's no power in this. You're never going to be free. I don't even know why you bother. And so now all of a sudden you got these two things coming at you, and you're making agreements with this one, with the fantasy stuff, and you're making agreements with this one because of the self-shame and aggravation. Then another one comes over, and its job is hopelessness, despair. And then another one comes over, and before you know it, it's possible to start kind of just walking around with your own little flock going with you everywhere you go. I think of, what was the cartoon character, Eeyore? Everywhere he went, there's like a cloud, over his head. Well, it's the same idea. I think some of us, we kind of take this little flock with us everywhere that we go. And we never deal with it, right? Because we never treat this as a spiritual warfare issue. And so as we never treat it as a spiritual warfare issue, that flock is just always with us. So again, we need to deal with it. Now, because spiritual warfare is primarily a legal foundation to it, and that is that they have to get permission by the agreements that we enter into, what we need to do is break those agreements and make them go. So Dr. Carl Payne, in his book, Spiritual Warfare, Christians, Demonization, and Deliverance, gives a very simple three-step process to this. I've got my book up there because he let me put this into my book. So you can get, but if you go to the bookstore, they're both over there. This basic premise here is I got to confess that I made the agreement. That's what the confession is. I confess I made the agreement with the enemy, and I gave in to the lie that fantasizing about this is good, or the idea that fantasizing about this somehow is okay enough, and I'm agreeing I'm going to do it. So I'm agreeing that I've done it. I'm also then may have to confess that I then beat myself up, for 3 hours afterwards, and was, with all of the shame, and I entered into more agreements. So I got to confess. So one of the things that's helpful to do at this point is just ask God, would you show me all of the agreements that I have entered into here, and start making a list. Well, I made an agreement with lust, I made an agreement with hopeless despair, made an agreement with shame, whatever. You start, listing them out. And then, and what you're essentially doing, then you look at him and say, yes, I agree with you, God, because that's what confession is. I agree with you, God, that it is true that I've done this. So that's step one, confession. Now, have you ever had this experience where you confess something, and then like 10 minutes later you confess it again, and like 10 days later you confess it again, and 10 months later you confess it again, and 10 years later, just for good measure, you confess it again? Right? So if I am confessing and confessing and confessing and confessing, what's missing? Freedom. What's really missing here is I'm asking God for forgiveness, but I'm not receiving it. And so one of the things that happens is if I find myself confessing the same sin over and over again, like I just feel so bad that I did that, please forgive me. What I'm not doing is I'm not saying, God, today I receive your forgiveness. Yes?
Question, is it that I'm not receiving it or that I'm not accepting it?
Well, I mean the same thing by it. So yeah, I'm not accepting it, yes. So I talked to a young lady one time, and she had jumped the gun and had sex with her fiance before they got married. And this was her story. She says, I've confessed it 1,000 times. Well, what that tells me is you're confessing it, but you haven't broken this thing. Okay? So we just stopped right there and prayed. In the name of Jesus, you know that you know what has happened, but today I am canceling any whatever permission that gave to the enemy, and I'm choosing to receive your forgiveness and to forgive myself. Okay? So by saying those words, right, I choose to receive your forgiveness and to forgive myself. She now says, now any demons that are still hanging around here have to leave and go where the Lord Jesus Christ sends you and do it now. Now, we did that prayer, and there was nothing dramatic that happened. You would never look at the situation and think anything changed. But before this, she was having nightmares over almost every night. And I met her a year later, and she was at a wedding, and she's like, hey, I just wanted you to know I haven't had a nightmare since we prayed that day. So, kind of the evidence or the fruit, if you will, of what had happened was she had been confessing it 1,000 times, but she hadn't actually been receiving forgiveness. And, the first time I ever ran into this was with a young lady who had had an abortion. And she had confessed this 1,000 times, and she had asked God for forgiveness 1,000 times, but she said, I believe God forgives me, but I can't forgive myself. And I was like, well, that's really fascinating, because after a while, honestly, I was getting frustrated with her. Have you ever done that? You ever tried to help somebody, you just end up frustrated with them, like, smack, smack, smack. And that just shows my level of maturity is the issue there, not any problem with them. It's like there's a maturity problem when somebody's coming for help, and I just want to smack. And so, but in this case, we've been just putting so many hours into trying to help her get through this. Finally, I ended up saying, so what you're telling me is that your sense of justice is greater than God's. And she was like, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, you're saying that God can forgive you, but you can't because his standard is satisfied, but your standard isn't? She goes, I never thought about it like that. And I'm like, hey, I'm figuring if God's standard is satisfied, yours, it's okay to forgive yourself. Yeah.
And what that goes back to is what Bryce talked about this morning.
Yeah.
About us being true with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that really helped me was being able to go ahead and forgive myself completely for what I've done and do what God said to do because he
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this is all part of integrity. This is all part of being a person of integrity, right? And that is we want to get to the point where we are completely honest about these things, but we aren't defined by them anymore. Yeah.
Have you ever noticed that there's a different kind of personality that's prone to self-condemnation more than most?
That's a good question. Is there a certain kind of personality that's prone to self-condemnation more than most? I'm not sure if it's a birth personality, so much as there are skills that never developed. And that is, there are some people who have learned to have like a depressive personality, but they weren't born that way. They just haven't developed the attachment skills and the joy, the ability to live with joy that is supposed to happen in a child's life. So I would say that I'm not sure that there's a personality type in the sense that we're born with that personality that is predisposed to these, but there is clearly people who have early childhood trauma and have a lot of trauma in their childhood are going to be much more predisposed to all of this. Yeah. Now, for those of you who weren't here at the first session, trauma is the absence of the good stuff that we need. So for a little child, that would be, for instance, maybe your mother never abused you or called you bad names, but she wasn't there for you and didn't know how to synchronize with your emotions. So when you were upset as a little kid, your mom would often be just go to your room, just leave me alone. Just I'm watching my soap kind of thing. Just take care of yourself. And so as a little kid, you basically had to parent yourself, and as a result of that, you don't really know, you've never figured out how does a person actually feel better after their emotions get all upset like this, because you weren't parented. You missed that. And so we call that an A trauma, the absence of what you needed. What you needed there was an engaged mother or an engaged father who would be relationally connected and available to you and help you get back to joy from this really upsetting emotion. And by having somebody who can meet you there and help you get back to joy from it, guess what? Now you are learning that skill. And so when they're not there next time, you know what that looks like, and you can do it for yourself. But you can't do it as a little kid until someone's doing it for you. So A trauma, the missing out on these important parental skills, these important times of connection and help from our parents, is enormously traumatizing, because we are growing up simply without the ability to handle an awful lot of things in life. And so that's why I'm 50 years old and still dealing with a 5-year-old's emotional capacity when it comes to certain things in life. And it's because of what I didn't get growing up, not because of something bad necessarily that happened to me. Does that make sense? So now again, the point here is not, therefore I can now blame my parents for everything in my life. The point here is that I've got to be honest about these things, and as an adult now take ownership of the fact that this is where I find myself. I've got to start doing something about this. And I loved what Steve Deneff said the other night about the washing machine, right? And the idea that I'm not going to experience real life change until I'm in a group where it's okay to be authentic and real and honest about these things. And that's where the clothes, help each other get cleaned up. The problem with too many of us is in our Christian communities, we're looking at porn on Friday night and trying to figure out how I'm going to feel good about myself by Sunday morning so I can go in there and with a smile. And instead of thinking, man, thank God for my church is the one place where I can go and I can share with some people about my brokenness. Now, again, as we pointed out before, one of the reasons we don't just have open mic here and say, everybody share your deepest, darkest secrets with everybody in the room, is not everybody here is safe. And so that's why it's not, just because we want safe communities, you can't mandate a safe community. Say, we will be a safe community, so everybody come up and share your dirty laundry. It doesn't work that way. I remember even as a pastor, I remember trying to open up about some of my struggles to the elder board and found out that was probably not a good idea. Because, their first question is, should we fire this guy or not? Not, how do we help? And so what it means is you just got to have people. And that's why, step one was building a team. You've got to have people that you can talk to and be open and honest with about these things. And ideally, we're helping the whole church get there. Okay? We're helping the whole church get there. But we've got to have communities along, and that's where things like Celebrate Recovery and ministries like this can be so effective, because they help to start the DNA of vulnerability and openness for communities. All right, so I don't remember what the question was that got into that, Brant. Yeah. Somebody more inclined to that kind of thing. Okay, all right. So spiritual warfare. All right. Obviously, this is not everything you need to know to launch your own spiritual warfare ministry, but this is hopefully enough to help you understand that there is a taking thoughts captive element of this. Right? When the birds show up and they start talking, the sooner I take those thoughts captive, the easier it is to stop the train. And there is also a stronghold tearing down part of this, and we tear that stronghold down sometimes in layers, right? Because sometimes we deal with one wound at a time and not all of the wounds at once. And sometimes we're dealing with, sometimes they're just, God in his mercy is like, you can't handle all of this today, so we're just going to take this a little bit at a time. And that's okay. So you're not doing it wrong if you pray a spiritual warfare prayer and you're not all better. It doesn't mean you're not doing it right. It just means there may be layers to this. So again, we just talked about really two big things. Inner healing prayer. So you got ministries like Theophostic Prayer Ministry, Emmanuel Prayer Ministry, and things like this where, they train prayer partners to sit down and help people go back to traumatic memories and get healing for them. And then we got ministries that are just devoted to spiritual warfare and helping people, deal with the demonic elements of what's going on in their life. And sometimes it can create the impression that that's all you need. That if you just do this, everything will be fine. Or if you just do that, everything will be fine. But there's a reason why we have 6 battle strategies. And it's because it generally takes some of all of this along the way. All right, any other questions on the warfare part of this? All right, if not, then we will go on to discuss maturity. Growing maturity. Okay. I just need an excuse to put that baby picture up there. I just like that. No, that's not me. That's actually very popular on the internet. I'm not. So we started out talking about maturity as like 8 ounces and 16 ounces, 32 ounces. Most of what I've learned about maturity, I've learned from Dr. Jim Wilder. And if you want a book on the maturity stuff specifically, I would recommend Living from the Heart Jesus Gave You. Is a good starting introductory point by Jim Wilder and his colleagues. And just to give you the background on some of this, Jim lived in Southern California, and there was a ministry I don't know if you're familiar with Dallas Willard, but Dallas Willard's wife, Jane, was the director of this center, and it started out as a coffee shop to reach out to like homeless people in the Pasadena area. And what they found was it quickly turned into a counseling center, that all these people needed help, had some really deeply severe issues in their life. They weren't homeless for no reason. They were very troubled people. And so it eventually grew into a counseling center with 30 full-time counselors on it, and Jim was the director of the center. And they began noticing some things because they were practicing spiritual warfare. They were practicing emotional healing prayer. They were practicing a lot of the things we've been talking about. But they said a lot of times people would get a breakthrough, and 3 days later they'd be right back where they were. And it wasn't sustained. And they were trying to figure out, why do some people who get a breakthrough sustain that breakthrough, and other people get a breakthrough and don't sustain it? Right? That's the question. Because we've all had those experiences, right? We think we're finally finished with something, and then it kind of resurfaces again, like, here I am again, what in the world's going on? And, maybe I didn't do that right, is usually where we go. But the problem often isn't that we didn't do that right, it's that there's another element or component to this. And what they found was that people who, 2 characteristics, people who were isolated and did not have a community that they could share their healing journey with, tended to regress. In fact, it wasn't a 10, it was like 100%. So that if you were isolated and you were not in a community where you could share your healing journey and experience with other people, in other words, if you weren't in the kind of washing machine where you could interact with others, you were going to regress. It was just a question of how long it was going to take. The other thing that they found was that this thing of maturity and emotional capacity. And that is that the lower your level of emotional capacity, the quicker you are going to regress. So if you are functioning at, so we'll call the 8 ounces infant level maturity. So if I'm functioning at infant level maturity, what that means is at 8 ounces, I can only function with about 6 ounces of emotional capacity or before things begin erupting and I go back to my addiction or I go back to whatever my problem was. And so they said long term, in the short term, we want to lower the stress, but in the long term, we got to grow this. And so they began to identify, on the basis of brain science, 19 skills that the brain needed to learn in order to be a fully mature, functioning person. Now, we do have a book in the books, and this is not just, a book advertisement, but, we do have a book by Chris Corsi called Transforming Fellowship that addresses these specifically 2 issues. Because Chris was mentored by Dr. Wilder and has developed a training called Thrive Training. He and his wife lead to help people learn exercises for developing these 19 brain skills. And just to put it in perspective, so Chris and Jen, they lived in Grand Rapids for a while, and they were working with really severely traumatized people who had lots of issues. Almost all of them had some sort of sexual addiction. And they started using these exercises with people to try to help them build some of the skills that they had missed out on. And Dr. Wilder and the Curseys would go back and forth, well, let's try this, And they were running support groups on a daily basis so they could immediately try the exercises right there with the support groups and say, well, this one seems to be working, this one doesn't. And they've kind of built this up. So if you want to know what the 19 skills are, what they look like, some of the basics, the reason he calls it transforming fellowship is this idea that the only way that you can learn these skills is in community. In other words, I can't do a lecture today on these skills and have you walk out with that skill. All I can do is let you know that the skill exists and encourage you to go out and start doing it any more than I could do a lecture and you could leave here and be able to play the piano. Okay, it's a skill. And so because they're skills, I have to actually do these things on a repeated basis. So let's start with some basics, though, some simple ones. We talked about earlier about trauma and how a lot of times kids don't get what they need from their parents growing up, and as a result, they're stuck. So one of the most classic skills that I think it's very helpful for us to learn is the skill of quieting. And quieting is the ability to sort of take a deep breath and let your mind be quiet. Now, about 10 years ago, when I first heard Chris Coursey explain this, I was like, that sounds Buddhist to me, right? It's like, that sounds like New Age, mumbo jumbo. I don't think I want anything to do with this. But the reality was I couldn't do it either. Because when I would go and quiet my mind just raced all the time. I would never shut off. I couldn't shut my brain off for anything. And so he's like, okay, well, try this. Try when you are quiet, thinking about things that you appreciate. And so I go, okay. So they suggested, for example, if you really like your morning coffee, So I got, a little latte and stirred it up and put it in a ceramic mug. And I'm sitting here holding my ceramic mug of latte and smelling it, going, oh, thank you, Jesus. I get to start my day with this latte. And man, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done. I don't know if you noticed the switch there, but you kind of went from appreciation to attack because my brain literally didn't know how to just stay in a place of joy and appreciation and peace for more than 3 seconds. Now, if your brain can't stay quiet for more than 3 seconds, you're going to have addiction issues. Just a question of what your addiction is going to be. You've got to be able to quiet. So that's skill number one, right? Skill number one of the 19 brain skills. I've got to be able to quiet myself. So let me give you just a couple of these things we can try. So one of them is just taking a deep breath, like suck it in for count of 12, and then blow it out for a count of 12. All right, let's just try it once, right? Then do it again. And then you just breathe. So that's about 15, 20 seconds, right? So some of you could do that, no big problem. That's great. Others of you are already like, I don't trust this. Your brain's already trying to problem solve. There's got to be something wrong with this. And that's the problem. We have a trouble quieting. So one of the things we recommend to people is that they practice this several times a day. Just practice quieting yourself for 1 minute. You don't have to do a 30-minute chant of a mantra, right? We're not doing this. We're just talking about quieting and focusing. And then you add to that joy. All right, so the second brain skill is the ability to share joy with somebody else. And And there's more we'll grow for these. But let me just give you a few of these for you to practice. So one of the ways that we quiet and build joy in our lives is quieting. The ability to quiet and grow joy is one of the fastest ways to grow your emotional capacity. Right? Learning how to quiet and how to grow joy. Because if you can quiet yourself and find joy, you don't have to be afraid of your great big emotions. Because you know you're not going to get stuck there. You know, this isn't the end of the world. Just because I'm feeling all frantic right now, I don't have to stay freaked out because I know I can quiet, I can come back, I can think about joyful things, I can get my mind in a better place, which is like Philippians 4:8. Therefore, whatever is good, true, lovely, beautiful, praiseworthy, think about these things. We want to get our minds there. So let me give you something you can practice here. And I use the acrostic GAMES to remember this. And it's a way to practice appreciation. So GAMES is gratitude, anticipation, memories, entertainment, and singing. So I'll walk through them one at a time so you understand where they come from. Gratitude is simply, what in this present environment do you have to appreciate? So you stop and think about it right now. What right now in this present environment do I have to appreciate? Now, some of us immediately go, well, I don't appreciate the pews. These things are really hard, right? And that's okay. And it's like, well, I don't appreciate how muggy it is, and how tired, And so it's kind of funny. Sometimes when we challenge ourselves to practice appreciation, a lot of times the first things that pop into our mind are what we don't have to appreciate. Which just what that tells me is my brain isn't used to this. My mind is not used to dwelling and settling into what is good and lovely and beautiful and praiseworthy and living there. My mind is used to staying in what is there to be afraid of and to be worried about and what problems are there to solve, and my mind gets used to staying there, and that's what racing minds do. Minds that are racing all the time are always looking for a problem to solve. So I'm going to quiet myself, and then I'm going to say, what do I have in the current situation to be grateful for? So for me, I've got a lot. As I'm grateful because I look around here, I see a lot of familiar faces. I see a lot of people who have been open and honest about the journey that they're on, who are engaged with this, and they're at a personal level. I know they're not perfect. I know they haven't, but they are making strides, and it's encouraging to me, and I'm grateful that there's so many people here who are on this journey for themselves, and so many people here that I know are actually helping other people on these journeys as well. And the beautiful thing is you don't have to have completed your journey to help somebody on theirs. I'm grateful for that. I'm actually grateful for rain. I like rainy day. It does make me want to leave and go read a book, but anyway, as much as I appreciate you, anyway. There's also A is anticipation, and that has to do with the future. Like, what do you have that you're looking forward to? Now, once again, if you are not used to this and your mind's not used to appreciation, when you think about the future, you will tend to think about all the problems that lie in your future first before you will be able to think about something you actually anticipate with joy. So what happens is I've got to say, okay, I acknowledge I've got problems waiting for me when I get home from Brown City Camp. I've got problems waiting for me out here that I acknowledge that those are true, but is there anything I have to anticipate that would actually be joyful? Anything I'm looking forward to? And what I find is that people who are depressed have a very hard time anticipating anything with joy, and people who are fearful have a very hard time anticipating anything with joy. Angry people have a hard time anticipating anything with joy. And so one of the things that we want to do is we're trying to grow our capacity, our emotional capacity, is I've got to practice getting my brain wrapped around the habits that build capacity. That's quieting and appreciation. So gratitude of what there is in the present, anticipation. Is there anything I'm looking forward to? And again, this doesn't have to be life-changing. It can be, hey, the ice cream line's going to be open tonight. Woo! Right? Just anything I can look begin collecting some pictures or short videos about those things that you can quickly scan and review easily. So my wife does this. She picks up her cell phone at night before she goes to bed, and she scans through these happy pictures, right? It's kind of part of her way of putting the day away, getting her mind into a good place before it's time to go to sleep at night. And so she's looking at her joy pictures. So, but having memories like this, having memories when your childhood, when you were a kid, what did you love to do? What brought you life and joy and excitement that you can remember? That's a second category. A third category would be moments when you felt particularly close to Jesus. Were there moments when you knew beyond a shadow of doubt that you were just in the presence of Jesus and it was a great feeling and a great moment, a great day? Begin collecting those moments and letting your mind go back and think about and dwell on those and remember those. And it's part of what it says in the Psalms. I will remember, oh Lord, the day I was in the Eastman Tabernacle, right, when the thunder came and So, but you can try to think of others, because some people love camping, so they think through camping memories. But the point here is that if you spend 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes in a row consecutively, 3 times a day, with your mind focused on what there is to enjoy in your life, whether it's in the present or in the future or in the past, what'll happen is you can actually begin to reset the brain chemistry up here so that joy becomes your default setting and the normal setting of your brain rather than anxiety or depression or anger or some of these other things. And to the extent that we are able to make joy that default setting, our emotional capacity grows. So one of the fastest things that we can do is learning to quiet and learning to practice gratitude. So the E is entertainment. Entertainment is just like invite some friends over and play a party game and have some food, right? Create an entertaining event. And one of the things we find is that joy is best when I'm sharing it with people. So I want to create events where I can share joy with other people. That's the E, the entertainment thing. And then S is singing. And if you ever notice when you're down, sometimes just singing out loud helps, right? And it's because actually in a brain science way, singing brings your left and right brains together. So the truth you're telling yourself with a song, helps. And some songs just have memories to them that are happy, and just singing that song brings back those emotions and those happy feelings, and that's positive and good for us too. So giving ourselves permission and actually even turning it into a spiritual discipline, if you will, of practicing gratitude and living in a place of joy can be very, very helpful. All right, another maturity growing skill is what VCR is what I call VCR. Now, most of us are old enough to know what a VCR is, right? But the VCR, in this case, means validate, comfort, recover. Validate, comfort, recover. What we mean by this is if you think about your brain as right brain and left brain, the right brain is the relational part of my brain, and the left brain is the problem-solving part of my brain. So when I'm functioning in my right brain, I am my relational self. When I'm functioning in my left brain, I'm in my problem-solving mode. So validation is basically a right brain to right brain connection with somebody else, saying, you're experiencing this emotion, I can meet you in that emotion and be relationally engaged and happy to be with you, even though you're having this emotion. Does that make sense? So validation is meeting somebody in their emotion and being happy to be with them in that emotion. Now, I can make it a simple process for you while you're trying to learn it. And that process is, well, your right brain listens to people differently than your left brain listens to people. So your left brain listens for problems. So if I'm a left brain listener and people are talking to me, my brain is listening for their problem, and as soon as I hear it, I interrupt the conversation and say, I know how to solve that. right? And they feel like, well, I wasn't done talking. You're like, yeah, but I know what your problem is. We can fix this. And so what happens is when I'm left brain listening and I'm only listening for problems, I jump straight into problem solving and I never validate the emotion that they're expressing. So we have to do the right brain work first and then go to the left brain problem solving work. There's an order to it. Right brain first, then left brain. I got to validate first and then comfort. Because when you're fixing someone's problem, what you're trying to do is comfort them. So you wouldn't think of comfort as a left brain thing, but that's really what it is. You're trying to make their problem smaller. You're probably taking something that's this big and make it smaller that they can handle it. So we start with validation. Validate goes like this. When you're listening to somebody, you're listening for their emotions. And so what you do then is you name the emotion that you're hearing them speak. And say, it sounds to me like you're feeling fear. Or it sounds to me like you're feeling shame. And then you give them some reasons, what it was and what you heard, that would lead you to believe that this is the emotion that they're feeling. Now, if you're correct, they're going to say, yeah, that's right. That is kind of how I'm feeling. And they will feel validated. Now, if you're wrong, you got to keep going. Well, I guess, okay, well, if it's not that you're feeling, talk to me some more. And you talk and you listen until you have correctly identified what the emotion is that they are in fact feeling and some of the reasons that they are feeling that way. So if you can name it correctly, they're going to feel validated. So, and if you can name it correctly and give them a few of the reasons why, you see why they're feeling that way. Now, got a raindrop on my head. Okay. Yeah. All right. Feel like I'm under Niagara Falls. There we go. I'm like, okay. So let's try something. Rather than me trying to outshout this, why don't you guys get into small groups of 4 and share with everybody a happy memory, one of your favorite Brown City camp memories, okay? Let's just grow a little bit of joy. Well, let's see if the worst of this passes in a minute, okay? Can we do that? So get into like groups of 4, share some of your happy, each person share one happy Brown City camp memory, and then we'll come back together in like 5-10 minutes and try this again. Singing.